is Ruth McDonald, and I'm Professor and Chair of the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition at Iowa State University. Today we're going to talk about GMOs. This is a very controversial topic. Some people feel very passionately about genetically modified organisms in food. And so what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the facts and the scientific evidence about what these are in food, where they are in the food supply, and a little bit about their safety. We have a really wide variety of foods in our food supply today. A lot of those did not exist in nature. They were created by breeding together different families of plants to create a new kind of plant. So we always think about broccoli as being one of the healthiest vegetables that you could eat. Broccoli is not a vegetable that exists in nature. It was actually developed by breeding together other plants. It was created by this hybridization process that farmers were using really from very early times in history of people. Genetically modified organism is a very complicated term for most people to understand. It's not an organism, it's a sequence of DNA that has been defined to encode for a specific trait. So we've been doing sort of that kind of thing with manipulating DNA in the food supply really for a long time. The difference between genetically modified organisms and the way that we've been doing it traditionally is that it's a very specific sequence of DNA that has been identified to give a very specific trait. So a lot of people wonder, when did we start using genetically modified organisms in food? And that happened in the late 1990s. The first crops that were genetically modified were the commercially viable crops of corn and soybeans and cotton, but we don't eat cotton. So corn and soybeans are the two that enter the food supply. That technology has been in the food system for all of those years. So the main use of genetically modified organisms in corn and soybeans were twofold. First, to make them herbicide resistant or to make them pest resistant. So the trait that makes them herbicide resistant allows that plant to survive being treated with an herbicide and not be killed. The pesticide resistant crops, one of the earliest one was Bt. Bt stands for Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a natural bacterium that lives in the soil. They were able to figure out what that gene was that encoded for that toxin, and they were able to put that into corn and soybeans so that when the pests eat the root of the corn or the soybean plant, they consume that chemical that's being produced by the plant and they die before they can destroy the plant. So it's a great benefit to agriculture to be able to have these traits in the crops so that farmers don't need to use as much chemical and they can reduce the inputs that they have in their farming practice. From corn and soybeans, we generate a lot of ingredients. So we generate corn oil and soybean oil. We generate starches and some sweeteners. We also generate proteins and fibers from those crops that are part of a lot of foods. So in the grocery store, if a package contains corn oil or soybean oil or any kind of a starch, it probably came from a corn or a soybean plant that had a genetically modified trait. The way that we extract those ingredients from corn or soybeans changes the chemical result of what we have. So a corn kernel, when you fractionate that, separate out the oil, separate out the starch, and leave the germ. So what goes into the food supply is the oil and the starch. From the starch we make sweeteners. Those two pieces of the corn plant, the fractions, don't contain any of the DNA or any of the protein that would identify it as a GMO source. There are some fruits and vegetables that are in the food supply that are genetically modified. A really great example is papaya. The papaya crop was being destroyed by a virus that they couldn't treat with a chemical treatment. So scientists figured out a way to insert a gene into the papaya that would resist that particular virus. And there's going to be a lot more crops that will come along in the future. So one of the big concerns we have right now is the amount of waste that we have in our food supply. We waste about 1/3 of the food that we produce. And one of the reasons why we waste so much is because it spoils too quickly. So genetically modified technology will allow us to create varieties that are more stable and that they don't spoil quite so quickly. The apple that was created recently is resistant to browning. So when you cut it, it doesn't become brown as quickly. And this means that we'll have less food waste. We'll be able to use those kinds of apples in salad bars and in lunch boxes and places where they would spoil otherwise. It typically takes a company 10 years or more from the time that they conceive of a new crop variety or animal variety until it gets approved to enter into the food supply. And in that time frame, they have to show that the trait will break down in the environment and in the human body, that it doesn't persist, that it doesn't have any allergenic response, that it isn't something that will do any damage to other plants in the environment. The point is that there is no risk, there is no safety issues associated with these traits for the reasons that I just explained. Chemicals that are used are safe and defined to be safe. There are government agencies that oversee the safety of genetically modified organisms. That includes the EPA, the USDA, and the FDA. And no crops or animals are released into the food supply until they've been able to be proven to be safe and that they don't have any human health risk. So as a consumer, as a mother who's raised 2 children, and as a nutritionist and someone who's concerned about how food affects our health, I want consumers to know that our food supply is safe. The use of genetically modified technology is just another extension of how we have been modifying our food supply to make it more abundant, more safe, and more affordable for all of the consumers.